Greetings, Assessment Center Study Group of South Africa. For those of you I have not met, I am Brian Hoffman. I was sorry to have to miss the conference this year. I've actually been to your last two conferences and have had a very good and educational time speaking with you about our research on assessment centers and about what you're doing in South Africa with your assessment centers. I'm very happy to be able to be here today to chat with you with modern technology about our new book. The book is Assessment Center Perspectives for Talent Management Strategies, and it was written along with my co-authors, George Thornton and Deborah Rupp. In George's video, he emphasized our theme that there is no one best way to design assessment centers. In my video, I will first be reviewing the evidence that led us to this conclusion. Then I'll discuss the implications of these findings, particularly as they regard our understanding of assessment center exercises. So let's first begin with a brief summary of the evidence underlying assessment centers. For over the past 3 decades, assessment center research has been ensnarled in a debate as to the appropriate focus for the design and the interpretation of assessment centers. In particular, this debate is centered on 3 perspectives to assessment center functioning. The first is a task-based perspective. The next is a dimension-based perspective. And finally, most recently, a multifaceted perspective on assessment centers has emerged. Our book provides the most comprehensive treatment to date of the evidentiary basis underlying these 3 perspectives. We sought to do so in a readily digestible and available format to summarize this past 10 years of assessment center research for you. A key source of evidence in the assessment center research involves the internal structure of assessment centers, usually examined with factor analysis. Although past studies have shown and consistently argued over the last 3 decades that assessment centers do not effectively measure dimensions, we review evidence to the contrary. And particularly, in the last 10 years, we've conducted numerous studies that have shown that when looked at using the appropriate analytic tools, we can and do actually support dimensions in assessment centers. This is important because this is true even when we are examining assessment centers that stem from a task-based perspective. So in other words, even when the assessment center was designed explicitly from a task-based perspective, we review evidence that suggests that dimensions are indeed still present. Now, having said that, it is important to note that the dimension effects are very, very small. So the exercise effects still continue to be larger than dimension effects. However, we do find support for dimensions. It's also important to note that based on the last decade or so of research, we tend to find evidence for a fewer number of dimensions than previously believed. So typically, we can support 2 to 3 distinct dimensions in assessment centers. However, having said all this, this is an important pattern of findings because it does suggest that there is value to both a task-based and a dimension-based perspective to assessment centers. A second source of evidence is based on associations with other variables. For example, by examining the relationship between assessment center dimension scores, assessment center exercise scores, and measures of personality and cognitive ability. The evidence we review in this chapter suggests that both dimensions and exercise scores correlate in meaningful ways with personality and intelligence measures. In other words, there is evidence to support the nomological network of both dimensions and exercises. This is important because it suggests that both perspectives have value. That is, we can support both dimension and exercise-based perspectives in our analyses of assessment centers. A final source of evidence, and this might well be the most important for the practitioners out there, involves criterion-related validity. In other words, the extent to which the assessment center scores are associated with outcomes that are of importance to the organization. We review evidence that suggests that both exercise scores and dimension scores have evidence for their criterion-related validity. And again, we believe this is important because it also suggests that there is value to both the dimension-based and exercise-based perspective. Now, having said that, this is one place where the evidence started to diverge a little bit for dimensions and exercises. When we reviewed this evidence, we showed that in actuality, dimension scores tend to engender somewhat higher criterion-related validity relative to exercise scores. So we do review evidence that shows that dimensions are the superior predictor to exercises. However, perhaps more importantly than this, the new evidence we review suggests that dimensions and exercises explain unique variance above and beyond one another. In other words, it seems that we're getting unique information from both dimension scores and from exercise scores. Again, just like the other two sources of evidence, this is very, very important because it does suggest that there is value to both dimension-based and exercise-based perspectives. So, as we put all this evidence together, we start to notice a trend, and that is that there's value in interpreting assessment centers using both dimension and exercise-based perspectives. And this leads us to the multifaceted perspective to assessment centers. This perspective argues that dimensions, exercises, and maybe even other sources of variance, such as dimensions within exercises, are a meaningful way to score and interpret assessment centers. So in other words, to summarize a rather lengthy chapter on the evidence supporting assessment centers, we basically provide evidence for all three perspectives: dimension-based, task-based, and multifaceted perspectives. And so as George said in his video, this suggests that there is no one best way. Or to put it differently, perhaps the best way is to consider all three perspectives in your designing of your assessment centers and when you are interpreting your assessment centers. So having now reviewed evidence for the dimension-based perspective and the exercise-based perspective, and then alternatively the multifaceted perspective on assessment centers, I want to turn our attention to exercises in assessment centers. So past research has tended to treat exercises as a relatively passive measurement vehicle. In other words, past assessment center research and practice has sort of treated exercise as a second-class citizen. We haven't paid a lot of attention to what's being measured in exercises and how to design assessment center exercises to best capture the dimensions that we're trying to assess. This is very important because this is a missed opportunity for assessment center research and practice. Exercises are at least half of the equation in assessment centers, and by ignoring their functioning, we have perhaps ignored a very important part of assessment center practice. In fact, a major advance in the past decade has been our analyses of whether assessment center exercises should be viewed as a source of meaningful variance or a source of assessor bias or halo bias. Now, historically, dating back to the early 1980s, assessment center exercise effects have sort of been viewed as a source of bias. In essence, like halo, the assessors are not able to accurately distinguish among different dimensions. However, new analyses suggest that this is not the case. These new analyses suggest that assessors are actually very, very reliable in their ratings in these different exercises. In other words, these exercise effects do not appear to reflect bias at all, but instead appear to reflect meaningful differences in how candidates perform in different situations. As I said earlier, this goes back to the idea that we need to pay closer attention to how people perform in exercises, as this is a meaningful source of variance in assessment centers. A key advance as a result of these perspectives is closer attention to the characteristics of assessment center exercises. So instead of just taking the same exercise and applying it across all different jobs, we've taken a closer look and started to find that the types of behaviors elicited by exercises differ depending on the content of the exercise. That is, if we vary the situation, we can get very, very different behaviors. So in this book, we review recent frameworks that have been used to categorize the situations measured by assessment center exercises. We propose an overarching framework that includes complexity, interpersonal skills, interdependence, structure, and technology. By having a better understanding of the key situations simulated by assessment center exercises, our hope is that we can more effectively design assessment center exercises to be used more effectively and more efficiently in applied settings. Based on this evidence, we then discuss how exercises might differ depending on one's talent management perspective. For instance, depending on one is involved with recruiting or high-stakes selection, succession planning, or diagnosis of strengths and weaknesses would all determine the specific characteristics of your exercise. So in sum, a key goal of this book was to bring together the past 10 years of research on assessment centers. A lot has happened in the last 10 years, and we wanted to provide a comprehensive but digestible summary of this research with a major focus on the implications for designing assessment centers and for interpreting assessment centers. As George discussed in his video, the evidence seems to support all three perspectives: a task-based, dimension-based, and multifaceted perspectives. And therefore, the perspective that one chooses to take will very much depend on the purpose of your assessment center. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch my video, and have a good conference. Goodbye.